Good afternoon, morning, evening, or night, people of the World Wide Web. I'm Daniel, and this is Driving and Dragons, the show where we talk about all things TTRPG while I either drive around aimlessly or work on a classic car. And today we are talking about setting up a timeline for the world you are running as a game master, as well as some player tips on how to view the game world for better immersion. Just as a standard reminder here, my ultimate goal with this channel from a monetary aspect is to generate enough money through Patreon sponsorships and YouTube to find these restoration projects so I can give them away to the people who interact with and support the channel. So hit the like, share, and subscribe and get your friends active in the comment section here so I can get a subscriber base needed to make that happen. As for my other motivations, I get an outlet for my hobby related ideas, as well as a platform for the world out there to find out about my D30 based game system that I hope to have ready for a Kickstarter this year. So let's get cracking on the topic of timeline prep for your TTRPG campaign. Please buckle up because this one might be long and I will certainly be a bit of a dense topic. As much as the idea pains me, I may need to follow up this with a live stream Q&A if there's enough interest. This is actually a topic that exists in the infinitesimal sliver of space where the Bro SR and good narrative players meet on a Venn diagram. It also is a vital part of the making a world that feels real and alive, as well as an integral part of making a long-running campaign that has both direction and scope. D&D campaigns in Peculiar, they last around 6 sessions based on, I believe, some research that Wizards of the Coast did with data that was pulled from D&D Beyond, but don't quote me on that. Suffice it to say that the statement has numerous asterisks after it, but it also passes the eyeball test. While the reasons are myriad, if you exclude outside factors like personal problems, schedule conflicts, etc., you find that it is generally up to one of these 3 reasons that a D&D campaign ends, and that's the players got bored because they felt the game was going nowhere, the players felt pigeonholed into a specific sequence of events, even if they didn't feel railroaded per se, or the game just kind of quote-unquote peters out, which I find is generally a symptom of the first reason, coupled with the lol so random nonsense that happens a lot of the time. Because as much as as much as joke characters sometimes can be a good thing, joke campaigns are just like joke characters. They're typically funny for about 2 sessions, and then by session 4, everybody is praying for a TPK. So what does this have to do with timeline prep and campaigns? Simply put, everything. To get the realism of a natural lived-in world, players need to feel that events are not static around them and respond only to their input. They need to know that the tavern keeper who hired them to kill the rats in his cellar isn't just standing there with a golden exclamation point over his head, spitting a couple of canned phrases out at random, waiting on them to show back up with a sack full of rodent tails. They need to see the world change in ways that have nothing to do with their actions and decisions, and they also need to see that their actions and decisions do have consequences when it counts. This is where the Bro SR portion kicks in. The Bros are an arrogant force of Dunning-Kruger jackassery, but they are absolutely right when they say that timekeeping in the game world is a critical element to an enduring campaign. As a narrative game master, building a world in which to forge a story with your players, knowing how that world is going to behave and when it is going to behave in that fashion are critical elements. Believe it or not, this is also a great preventative measure a GM can take against players feeling driven by the plot instead of driving it themselves, and it can also make your adventure hooks or mission opportunities feel far less artificial. I would also like to add, as a special aside, that if you are playing an episodic mission-based game like Cyberpunk, Traveler, or Call of Cthulhu, This can seriously help you when it comes to making the various scream sheet articles and investigations feel more natural. The first step is to determine your time frames. Regardless of whether you use classic stop time, where the only time that passes is time expressly stated to have passed at the table while you're in session, or you use something like a strict one-to-one time where the real world calendar and the game calendar march together in lockstep, there must be a standard for tracking the world events alongside the character events. I personally suggest stop time for games with single groups. Though, if you're playing a West Marches style where numerous groups operate simultaneously and players often have multiple characters, a system that continues to operate between sessions is necessary. But I'll save you those details for a video on timekeeping. For this video, we'll use stop time where the only calendar that the GM has to pay attention to is the actual game world calendar, since that is the way the vast majority of players play the game and what we're familiar with. I'm also going to use the real world Gregorian calendar we're all familiar with in different examples. Just know that it works equally well with a fantasy calendar that you choose to make up for your world. And in fact, it makes managing that calendar easier, because if you've got it as an ever present part of your campaign, it becomes more natural for you to have that, that 9-month, 3-season calendar that you use, or that system that's got wet season, dry season, etc., however you set it up based on your game world. Once your calendar's ready and you know how you plan to track it, it's time to start plotting out the world your characters will play in. I like to start big and more diffuse, and then get smaller and more focused in this regard. So you begin by determining how long your world has existed, or at least how long the relevant civilizations in your world have existed. Next, plot out any era-defining events. An era-defining event is an event that's so significant that it splits the calendar. In the real world, this would be the life of Christ breaking the Gregorian calendar into before Christ and Anno Domini, or BC and AD, or the Hebrew calendar splitting at the creation of man, or the Chinese calendar being divided into the reign of the Yellow Emperor onward or before the Yellow Emperor. To accomplish this, you just need to ask yourself these questions. A, what year is it? What happened in year one to make that year one? Is there anything recognized before year one? And how many year ones have there been that matter to the campaign? That last part is pretty important to those of us with world builder's disease. Quote unquote, that matter to the campaign. There's no need to break down eras that play no role in your game. Not only does it save time, it also leaves openings that your players can explore later. For example, if the time between when the gods created your world and the founding of the capital city of the dominant nation for your players present don't figure into your plans, don't bother fleshing out major events, new eras, divided timelines, etc. Leave it as the before times or the age of mists and get on with it. Not only did you focus more time getting the stuff that matters ready, you also left it so that if you do later decide that the before times is something that plays in, you can tailor it to fit the narrative your players have already created. It is a lot easier to write an ancient prophecy if the players have already fulfilled it for you. You'll see this as kind of a theme throughout any of this. The closer your calendar is to the players themselves, the more detailed what you put on it is. The closer the events are, the smaller and more regional events that show up. And the further you get away from the players time-wise, either forward or back, the more global and broad scale those events get, and the further apart they are, because the minutia doesn't matter as much as the big events. So your game is set in the 1200th year of the sun. a calendar that started when the first emperor of Altoona came to the barbaric surface world and left the Dark Cradle to forcibly enlighten the ancient surface people. Now detail out a handful of major events from Year of the Sun 1 to Year of the Sun 1200. Once again, this is broad scale. However, you want your events to have a lower threshold in terms of importance the closer together as they move closer to the year 1200. So when you're back in the year 100, it's only really broad scale global events, the kind of stuff that everybody's going to know about. And then as you start getting closer to 1200, you're going to start having things like what's happening in the local region and things that are maybe important to the people in that region, but not so much to the world at large until they become the source of a problem. Think of this like zooming in. This process will vary based on your individual campaign and playstyle, but as a basic kind of guideline, go back as many as 5 years from the start of your campaign, saying what were the most significant things that happened this month at most, and plot them for the 100 to 200 years before that, 2 to 3 generations. What's the most significant thing that happened in this 5 to 10 year period? Remembering that nothing is a perfectly acceptable answer. Going back further, start thinking in terms that define decades, then 50-year periods, then centuries, etc. For those first 1,000 years of the sun, touch only on the really big stuff. Things like 250 year of the sun, Altoona reaches peak under the Emperor Sylvanus. 315 YS, Great Plague devastates all non-elves. 330 YS, Imperial family deposed as other races blame elves for the plague. Alatar IV is the last elven emperor of Altoona. General Atrox Redbeard becomes Emperor Redbeard I. And then 550 YS, Altoona Empire fractures into numerous nations as surface peoples, once ruled by elves, rebel against the crown. You might also make even larger scale notes about realms adjacent to, but outside the scope of your campaign, such as 625 YS, last remaining Dark Elf city destroyed in the Dark Cradle, or 900 YS, Dark Dwarves release ancient dragon of shadows from the deepest reaches of the Dark Cradle. The idea is that until you reach the most recent 1 to 2 generations of all but your longest lived major races in your world, you keep it large scale. Once you get to that mark, in the case of this example, the past 200 years, then we start putting in place the foundation for our campaign. We know the elves were blamed 900 some years ago for a disastrous plague. We know the major empire they ruled for 330 years was taken over by dwarves and collapsed 650 years ago. Now we start fleshing things out, like how many human, dwarf, halfling, or gnome nations are there? Who gets along with who? Are the elves still reviled, or are they accepted again, or does it vary based on where they're at? Do they have their own empire? Many of these answers are going to be found in the campaign idea that we started with. I knew all along I was going to put my players in a world where elves are social pariahs and who once ruled the world, and they're now live in secret communities deep in the forest. I knew all along the various nations would be divided more along racial lines from within a collapsed existing multi-ethnic empire, as opposed to their coming from their own natural places of origin. My ancient timeline just put a framework to how we got from Year of the Sun 1 to the state of affairs in the world our PCs are born into. So we already had our theme, we already had our campaign idea, we already knew what we wanted to do. Now we just kind of plotted out how we got from beginning of time or beginning of that era to now on our calendars. In these last 200 years, we plot out the area around where the campaign starts. We take points that we already know, like what nations are at war and why, what nations recently came to peace, and how stable that peace is, what kind of political unrest there is, what new monsters appeared and where they came from, all the things that are the background for your campaign adventures. And then we take those and plot them out on the timeline. Now we finally get to the last months before the campaign. I personally would not want to deal with more than 5 years, which is 60 months. Realistically, just doing the year leading up to the start is typically more than enough. Let's face it, a lot of game masters don't do this level of prep, and it kind of bites them a lot of times because they don't know the why. And if you don't know the why, you really don't have a good reason for what's going to happen in the future to make things feel like they fit. Start to include more regional events as you close into the start of the game. Now that the setup is complete, let's get on to how we plot your actual campaign calendar and use that in your campaign. As stated before, this example is going to use the good old Gregorian calendar. I'm just going to have 31 days in the month, January through December, and really we're only going to plot out a month here really for our example. Take your year, January through December. Outline the big events of the year. Focus on the regions that your character's in. This is where things like January 7, General Greysteel of the 9th Imperial Army visits Dim Harrow Keep and delivers the Edict of Favored Iron, increasing taxes and setting curfew on non-dwarves. January 15, Magistrate Stonefellow executes a local gnome woman for violation of curfew. January 17, woman's husband and family assault an Imperial convoy. And January 21st, rebel gnomes attack the Imperial garrison at Dim Harrow Keep. Make more events with more definition, closer together early. Here we have 4 events in January. Well, maybe we have 2 things plotted out in February, March, and April, and then 1 each all the way through December, outlining the progress of the Gnome Rebellion against the Dwarves of Altoona as it blossoms into a Gnome-Dwarf war, all of which started in this old keep town on the border of the Gnome Nation. Your players start in Dim Harrow Keep on January 1. Plenty to do there. It's tough living, but the community is happy. The population is mostly gnomes and dwarves who, for the most part, get along. You have a few hooks. A barkeep had a young kid rob him, and now he's on the run from the sheriff. He'd like the party to go track this kid down so that he can get back his stolen ale, but also because he wants the kid to get smuggled across the border into the gnome country because dwarf justice is really harsh. And it's too harsh for a mistake made by a young kid. Meanwhile, the dwarves want him brought to justice. So there's 2 hooks there for the same chase the kid adventure. Maybe there's a pack of wolves that are killing local livestock that need to be hunted down. And maybe there's an old local story about an ancient elven treasure that was somehow buried in the escape tunnels under the old keep. You can have all kinds of things in there for them to find to do around this town. But whatever those players choose to do, you need to keep note of the time. They take 3 days to track down the kid, and they take another 5 to get back to the town while evading the dwarf patrol, being slowed down by the kid and whatnot. When they get back to town, whether it took 5 game sessions or 1 game session for that adventure to take place, it's now January 8th. The day after the Edict of Favored Iron. Immediately, the PCs see the increased dwarf army presence from the newly garrisoned magistrate. In town, the atmosphere is tense. News from gnomes that are being forced to turn over most of their remaining stores from the last harvest. Dwarven tax collectors, harassing people. Dwarves are allowed to keep their coin and their goods. This is where you start to see dwarves starting to take liberties with their gnome neighbors. Perhaps the tavern keeper expressed concern about his daughter while taking the party to smuggle the young thief across the border for him. The point is, no matter what the player characters did from January 1 to January 8th, the edict was delivered on the 7th, and it immediately raised tensions in the town. If they go on another adventure that takes 10 days, the calendar advances 10 days along with them. It's now the 18th of January, and the town is like a kicked anthill as the dwarves go into crackdown mode, and the gnomes scramble to either escape or comply with the dwarves or fight back or whatever as the troops are going crazy following the convoy attack. You can do the same thing while you're looking in here. When they're tracking that kid down and they're coming back in, you know that that large dwarf force is supposed to arrive in town to deliver the edict on the 7th. Maybe they notice that big army coming into town. They wonder what's happening. They know that tomorrow they're going to get there, and there's this big army that's either moving away or moving towards the town. There's that foreshadowing there. Each of these calendar advancements change the situation in the region surrounding the town, providing more questions for the players to seek answers to and more natural follow-up adventure hooks for them to latch onto and start to explore. As the timeline advances, you as the game master pull out your calendar and you make adjustments to the future events based on the direction the characters' actions take them, as well as to account for anything the players do that has a real impact on the story. Perhaps they haul that thieving kid back to town for the dwarves, and he ends up being that first execution under the brutal edict of favored iron, instead of some gnome girl that was caught after curfew or something. Maybe the PCs become a mercenary force to stop the rebellion in its tracks and become the actual trigger for the gnome dwarf war. And instead of the event that you maybe previously put out in March to kick off that war, back here in February or late January, it's actually the PCs taking out that gnome rebellion that actually triggers that war. More than anything, this becomes an organizational tool that fills itself in and takes its form as your players progress through the campaign. It can be taken as far as you like, even going so far as to plot major weather events or day-to-day conditions on there. You fill in the blanks as you go, making narrative adjustments a few sessions in advance. The end result is a story that slowly solidifies itself along a logical, natural path that doesn't feel like a pre-planned story for your players to participate in, because in the end it isn't. Each choice they make influences the future you plotted out, even if that influence is to simply let history take its course. Over time, the collection of small adjustments adds up, and 6 months into your campaign, those players can look back and they can see their influence on the game world around them, feeding that curiosity and ownership in what happens next. Eventually, you're on X talking about your 4-year-old campaign and trying to decide whether you want to transition your campaign to the new edition or that new system that just came out. That's really all I've got for you on this right now. This kind of game master world building can be refined or relaxed to almost any degree in order to fit your needs as a group and your needs as a GM. But in any capacity, I promise you that the rewards will be well worth the investment. This is where prep is still prep. This is where, even if you're just going to turn them loose, you can still do this. You have your calendar there. You know what they did in the past week, and you can say, well, it influenced this and it influenced that. And it brings in more stories for your players to explore and find. Even if you're going totally gonzo with no structure and you're not plotting out anything ahead of you, if you plot out what's behind you, you give the players something to feed on. Now, players, I'm going to give you a little piece on this too. Your game master should be cueing you into the calendar up until when you start. Look at that calendar. Find the interesting things. Ask questions about them. For one, that's going to give the game master triggers to develop more story, to develop more events, and to flesh things out a little bit more. And it's going to inherently lead you to create those backstories and those character ideas that actually get used in the future, because you started from a position of asking questions about world events that can be worked into the story as you built your character. Pay attention to it. It's real simple. Glance through it, see how things are going, and let that advise your character ideas. And it's going to enhance your investment in the world as well, as you start to see the things that you found important in the past come to fruition in the future. All right, guys, like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.